The scale hangs from a wooden beam under a tin roof, and it is not weighing gold. It is weighing rubber. And according to survivor testimony from the era, if the ball on the pan was too light, someone could lose a hand. The year is 1907. The place is La Chorrera, a trading post carved into the Putumayo forest between Peru and Colombia. Smoke curls from a slow fire nearby, where raw latex, milky and warm, is being turned over a paddle until it thickens into a dark, elastic lump. The smell is sharp and sweetish, like burnt caramel mixed with turpentine. A whip cracks somewhere behind the huts. Nobody looks up. This is routine. A man named Armando Normand, an overseer for the same rubber company operating in this region, keeps similar ledgers nearby, and his name will later appear, in black ink, inside a British government report that the world cannot ignore. For now, he is simply the overseer who sets the quota. Every worker of the Huitoto and Bora peoples owes a fixed weight of rubber, delivered every few weeks, or the punishment begins. What is strange, if you stop to think about it, is that none of this violence is happening because rubber is rare. It is happening because rubber, suddenly, is everywhere. Every bicycle tire in Paris, every telegraph cable insulated for the ocean floor, every raincoat in London depends on this same sticky tree sap. Somewhere between a jungle and a stock exchange, a substance that used to bounce in children's hands became something men were willing to kill for. To understand how a tree's tears became a weapon, we have to go back a very long way, not 3 days, nearly 35 centuries. Around 1600 BCE, in the humid lowlands near what is now Veracruz, Mexico, the Olmec people were already working with the sap of the Castilla elastica tree. Archaeologists excavating a site called El Manati found rubber balls preserved in a bog there. Radiocarbon dated to that period, some of the oldest processed rubber objects known anywhere on Earth. Picture the tree bark cut with a stone blade, a thin white liquid welling up like a wound weeping. The Olmec, and later the Maya and the Aztec, mixed this latex with the juice of morning glory vines, a natural process that, without any understanding of chemistry, already changed the sap's molecular structure enough to make it bouncy rather than merely sticky. They shaped it into solid balls for a ritual ball game played on stone courts, the thud of rubber against rock echoing through ceremonial cities centuries before Rome existed. When the Spanish arrived, they were baffled by what they saw. The chronicler Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, writing in his 1526 History of the Indies, described natives playing with balls that leapt back off the ground almost like something alive. European soil, hard-packed dirt roads, had nothing that behaved this way. A stone dropped, stayed dropped. This substance refused to. For more than 2 centuries after that, rubber stayed a curiosity. A strange souvenir from the tropics, nothing more. Then, in 1736, a French scientist named Charles-Marie de la Condamine, on an expedition to measure the exact shape of the Earth near the equator, collected samples of the milky Amazonian sap that he later presented to the French Academy of Sciences in Paris. He recorded the local name used by indigenous people, caoutchouc, which European tongues eventually flattened into caoutchouc. A few years later, another Frenchman, an engineer named François Fresneau, working in French Guiana through the 1740s and into the 1750s, studied the material closely enough that historians of chemistry sometimes call him the forgotten father of the rubber industry. He described how the substance could waterproof cloth, how it stretched, how it seemed built for a use nobody had yet invented. That use arrived in Scotland in 1823, when a chemist named Charles Mackintosh patented a method of sandwiching a rubber solution between layers of fabric to make it waterproof. His name became the word for the coat itself, the Mackintosh, and for a moment, rubber looked like the future of clothing, transportation, everything that needed to keep water out. But the future had a flaw, and it revealed itself with the seasons. In summer heat, rubberized goods turned soft, sticky, foul-smelling, sometimes melting together into a useless mass in warehouses from Boston to London. In winter cold, the same material turned brittle as old bread, cracking apart at the first hard frost. Newspapers of the 1830s described whole shipments of rubber shoes and coats ruined within a single season, entire fortunes rotting on shelves. Investors who had rushed toward this miracle material now rushed away from it just as fast. Rubber, it seemed, could not survive its own promise. One man refused to accept that. His name was Charles Goodyear, and by the mid-1830s he was, by any practical measure, a failure. He had already gone bankrupt once in the hardware business. He was jailed for debt in Philadelphia. His children reportedly went hungry, while he spent what little money the family had on chemicals, sulfur, lead, whatever he thought might tame rubber's temperamental nature. Neighbors, according to accounts from the period, thought he had lost his mind, a man obsessively boiling rubber scraps in a household kettle while his family suffered. The exact moment of his breakthrough has become part legend, part record, and historians are careful to separate the two. The often repeated story says that in 1839, in Woburn, Massachusetts, Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove, and instead of melting into a ruined puddle, it charred at the edges while staying firm and elastic at its core. Goodyear himself gave slightly different versions of this event over the years, and some historians treat the dramatic stove accident as embellishment layered onto a slower, more deliberate process of experimentation. What the historical record does confirm is that by 1839, Goodyear had found that heating rubber together with sulfur transformed it permanently, making it strong in heat and flexible in cold. He called the effect vulcanization, after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. It should have made him rich. It did not. In 1843, in England, a rubber manufacturer named Thomas Hancock filed his own patent for essentially the same vulcanization process, just 8 weeks before Goodyear secured protection in Britain. The two men had never met, and whether Hancock arrived at the discovery independently or through samples that had reached England from Goodyear's earlier experiments is still debated by historians of technology. Goodyear did win the American patent in 1844, but legal battles over the discovery consumed years and enormous sums. When Charles Goodyear died in 1860, he was reportedly still around $200,000 in debt, a staggering sum for the era. The company that today carries his name, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, was founded decades after his death by people who simply chose to honor him. He never owned a share of it. So a man ruined by rubber gave his name to an empire built on it. That alone should make you pause. But here's where the story turns, and turns hard. Because vulcanized rubber did not just stay waterproof in the rain or flexible in the cold, it made rubber suitable for something no one had needed it for before: the inflatable tire, patented for bicycles and then, in the 1890s, for the first automobiles. Suddenly the world did not want rubber by the barrel. It wanted rubber by the ship's hold, by the ton, by an amount that the wild rubber trees scattered through the Amazon jungle could barely keep pace with. And that demand is the direct, straight line back to the scale hanging under the tin roof at La Chorrera. The overseer weighing a man's quota of rubber in 1907 was not enforcing some ancient, timeless cruelty of the jungle. He was enforcing a modern industrial supply chain, one that stretched from a Putumayo rubber tree straight to a Parisian bicycle factory, a supply chain made urgently necessary by Charles Goodyear's kitchen experiments 70 years earlier. The child bouncing a rubber ball and the enslaved rubber tapper bleeding a tree in the same decade were connected by a single global market, even though neither of them would ever know the other existed. This was not confined to South America. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the Congo Free State, personally owned by Belgium's King Leopold II, an almost identical system was operating on a comparably vast scale through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. Villages were assigned rubber quotas. Failure to meet them brought brutal punishment, and colonial soldiers were required to account for every bullet fired by presenting a severed hand as proof it had been used on a person, not wasted on an animal. Missionaries and photographers, including Alice Seeley Harris, documented these mutilations in photographs taken around 1904, images that shocked audiences in Europe when they were published and helped fuel an international reform campaign led by the journalist E.D. Morel. Roger Casement, the same British consular official who would later investigate the Putumayo, had already investigated the Congo in 1903 and 1904, producing a report so damning that it is widely credited with helping turn public opinion against Leopold's personal rule over the territory. 2 continents, 2 colonial regimes, 1 commodity driving both. Rubber, the substance that bounced harmlessly in an Olmec Ballgame 3,500 years earlier, had become one of the most lethal commodities of the industrial age, not because of what it was, but because of how badly the world suddenly wanted it. The horrors eventually surfaced into daylight, though not quickly, and not because of moral awakening alone. Casement's 1912 Putumayo report, presented to the British Parliament, forced a public reckoning, since British capital had financed the Peruvian Amazon Company operating in the region. Newspapers in London printed testimony describing torture, starvation, and killings tied directly to failure to meet rubber quotas. Public pressure led to hearings, resignations, and international condemnation, though historians still debate how many indigenous people died during the Putumayo rubber period, with estimates in different sources ranging from tens of thousands upward, a grim uncertainty that reflects how poorly these deaths were ever recorded in the first place. But it was not moral outrage that ended the Amazon rubber boom. It was a plant, and a decision made decades earlier by a British explorer named Henry Wickham. In 1876, Wickham gathered around 70,000 seeds from wild Hevea brasiliensis rubber trees in Brazil and shipped them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. Popular accounts, repeated for generations, describe Wickham as smuggling the seeds out under the pretense that they were delicate botanical specimens meant for a foreign monarch, avoiding Brazilian export scrutiny through clever deception. Some historians now push back against the more theatrical version of this story, pointing out that Brazil had no specific law against exporting rubber seeds at that time, which makes the word smuggling, in the strictest legal sense, somewhat exaggerated. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Those seeds, germinated at Kew, were sent on to British colonial plantations in Ceylon and Malaya, where rubber trees could be grown in organized, efficient rows instead of scattered wild through impenetrable jungle. By the 1910s, plantation rubber from Southeast Asia was cheaper and easier to harvest than anything the Amazon's forced labor camps could produce. The wild rubber economy of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia collapsed within a matter of years. Manaus, the Brazilian city that rubber wealth had transformed into an improbable jungle metropolis, complete with a grand opera house, the Teatro Amazonas, completed in 1896 with imported Italian marble, and French chandeliers shipped up the river by steamboat, slid quietly into decline. Grand buildings stood half empty while the forest, patient as ever, began creeping back toward the edges of town. Here is the part worth sitting with. The system that had enslaved and mutilated thousands of people in the name of rubber was not defeated by conscience. It was defeated by a competitor with cheaper seeds and straighter rows. The moral reckoning came afterward, almost as an afterthought to the economics. Rubber's next great crisis arrived on the other side of the world, decades later, wrapped not in colonial violence, but in global war. In December 1941 and through 1942, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia, seizing British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, territories that together had been supplying roughly 90% of the natural rubber reaching the United States before the war. Almost overnight, American factories building tanks, aircraft tires, and gas masks faced a shortage severe enough that the government began rationing gasoline in the United States largely to conserve rubber tires, not fuel. Scrap rubber drives asked ordinary Americans to donate old tires, garden hoses, even rubber-soled shoes to the war effort. The response was an enormous, deliberate act of chemistry at industrial scale. American companies including B.F. Goodrich, Standard Oil, and DuPont, working under wartime government direction, expanded production of synthetic rubber, particularly a type called styrene butadiene rubber, built from petroleum rather than tree sap. Wallace Carruthers, a chemist working at DuPont's research laboratories, had already developed neoprene, an earlier synthetic rubber, back in 1930, a discovery that suddenly proved strategically vital a decade later. By the war's end, American factories were producing synthetic rubber by the hundreds of thousands of tons annually, a wartime industrial mobilization that changed rubber from a purely agricultural commodity into something that could, if necessary, be manufactured entirely from oil. That single wartime shift still shapes the material sitting under your car right now. Today, the tires on most vehicles are a blend. Part natural latex still tapped from hevea trees on plantations across Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Part synthetic rubber refined from petrochemicals in facilities that would be unrecognizable to Charles Goodyear. Surgical gloves, rubber bands, bicycle inner tubes, the soles of the shoes on your feet right now, all descend from the same tangled lineage, part ancient jungle ritual, part colonial atrocity, part wartime desperation, part quiet daily convenience. There is something almost poetic, and a little unsettling, buried inside the material itself. Vulcanized rubber, at a molecular level, is made of long polymer chains that get chemically linked together by sulfur bridges during Goodyear's process. When you stretch a rubber band and let it go, those linked chains snap back toward their original arrangement, a real, measurable physical property that material scientists sometimes describe using the word memory. Rubber genuinely remembers its shape. Stretch it, twist it, compress it under a car's full weight mile after mile, and it keeps trying, at a molecular level, to return to what it was before. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with the next time you pull on a glove or peel a rubber band off a bundle of mail. How much of what makes daily life so effortlessly comfortable was assembled somewhere along a chain of suffering that never made it into the history books most of us read in school? The Olmec who first bounced that sap-soaked ball at El Manati never could have imagined an overseer's scale in the Putumayo, or a scrap rubber drive in wartime Ohio, or a warehouse of gloves in a hospital today. Yet every one of those moments is stitched into the same elastic thread. Think back over what the substance carried. A jungle ballgame 3,500 years old. A bankrupt man in a debtor's cell who accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, taught rubber to survive both fire and frost, then died owing more money than he ever earned from it. A colonial economy in two different empires that turned a tree sap into a currency of mutilation and forced labor. A quiet act of seed smuggling, or perhaps just clever opportunism, that toppled that same economy within a single generation. And a wartime laboratory that taught rubber to be born from oil instead of bark, ensuring it would never again depend on a single forest, a single colony, a single desperate man with a kettle. So the next time you feel a tire-grip wet pavement or stretch a rubber band around a stack of papers, ask yourself what that small ordinary comfort actually cost, and who paid the price you will never see. Ask yourself whether we have truly moved past that history, or simply hidden it further down the supply chain, out of sight the way the Amazon jungle eventually swallowed Manaus's fading opera house. Rubber bends, it stretches, it forgives almost any shape you force onto it. But somewhere inside its own chemistry, it never really lets go of what it once was. Rubber remembers. Main sources for this story include John Loadman's Tears of the Tree, Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost, Barbara Weinstein's The Amazon Rubber Boom, and Roger Casement's original 1912 Putumayo report to the British Parliament. The full list is in the description.